This video is for people who think that the Soviet Union was a terrible place to live and it was undemocratic. It also refutes the argument that Stalin or the Soviet Union starved its people. Also, it seems that the Soviet Union had a more democratic government than the US or European quote-unquote democracies did. Most of the sources used in this video are a little biased towards communism, but these are the only sources I could find, so if you have any other sources that disprove mine, feel free to link them in the comments. Otherwise, enjoy the video. The first thing that we'll discuss in this video is the Soviet Constitution of 1936 that establishes ownership, democracy, and Soviet citizens' rights. People say that the Soviet Union was a dictatorship and undemocratic. That's simply not true. According to the Constitution of the USSR of 1936 in Article 3, it states, "In the USSR, all power belongs to the working people of town and country as represented by the Soviets of Working People's Deputies." In Articles 4 through 7, it states that the state would own nature and its natural resources. Farms would be owned collectively and cooperatively, but small farms would be personal property, where all animals and crops would be personal property as well. You may claim that the collectivized and cooperatively owned farms failed. While in 1923 to 1933 there was the Holodomor famine, the Soviet Union quickly recovered the next year. Getting back to the articles, they also state that the factories, railways, air transport, banks, and postal services were owned by the state. People like to make the statement that the Soviet Union took possession of everything everyone owned, but in Article 10 of the 1936 Constitution, it says, "The right of citizens to personal ownership of their incomes from work and of their savings, of their dwelling houses and subsidiary household economy, their household furnitures and utensils, and articles of personal use and convenience, as well as the right of inheritance of personal property of citizens, is protected by law." So if anyone claims that the state owned everything, Article 10 proves that wrong. When it comes to democracy in the Soviet Union, it existed, but it didn't look or function entirely like a typical capitalist democracy. On a national scale, from Articles 31 to 47 of the Constitution, it establishes the Soviet of the Union and Soviet of Nationalities. Each member of the Soviet of the Union was elected by the citizens directly to represent 300,000 citizens. As for the Soviet nationalities, they were elected based on the size of each region within the Soviet Union. The smaller the region, the less members for representation. Every 4 years, the Supreme Soviet, which was the Soviet of the Union and the Soviet of Nationalities, held elections for every member. These elections determined who the new Soviet leader or premier would be. Each member in each chamber had equal right to introduce legislation. If there was a disagreement in the Supreme Soviet, there would be 2 rounds of answering the question forwarded to both chambers. If all of that failed, then the Supreme Soviet dissolved and new elections were held. When talking about how different countries, SSRs, and the USSR worked, in Articles 79 to 88 it establishes that the Soviets had a Council of People's Commissars of a Union Republic. The commissars were chosen by the Supreme Soviet's members and managed in SSR's industrial production and anything state-owned in the SSR. As for the governments of ASSRs within each SSR, which would basically be states in the US and sizes, in Articles 89 to 93 it establishes the Supreme Soviet of the respected ASSR. Each member was elected and served for 4 years, and they chose their own Council of People's Commissars to perform the same duties, though on a smaller scale, as the Council of People's Commissars of an SSR. If we go down to the local level of an ASSR, in Articles 94 to 101, every region, territory, areas, districts, cities, and rural localities had a Soviet of Working People's Deputies. Every member was elected by the people of the region, territory, etc. for 2 years. They drew up local budgets and directed economic and cultural organization and development. When it comes to the electoral system laid out in Articles 134 through 142, everyone had 1 vote and every ballot was secret. The only people that couldn't vote were insane people and people who had been convicted of crimes that had sentences removing voting rights. Candidates in elections were nominated by organizations of the Communist Party, trade unions, cooperatives, youth organizations, and cultural societies. Every member of the Soviet of Working People's Deputies elected had the duty to report with their electors and could be recalled based on the decision of the majority of the electors wanting to remove their elected member from their office. So after reading these articles in the USSR 1936 Constitution, it seems that the USSR was democratic, and I dare say more than that of the USA at the time. While the Soviet Union was democratic in terms of how the government was structured, the justice system of the Soviet Union needs to be assessed too. In Articles 103 to 112, it establishes that the Soviet Union has Supreme Court for the national level as well as all the other levels, as said in the democratic government part of the video before this one. Each Supreme Soviet was elected by the Supreme Soviets of either an SSR, ASSR, or local governments. When it comes to the People's Courts, which handled smaller cases such as robbing, assault, etc., they were elected by the people of the SSR, ASSR, or locality that they were in for 3 years. Every case was heard in public with the exception of some for varying reasons. This information shows that Soviet law established pretty much the same judiciary processes as US law at the time, the only difference being that lesser courts were elected by the people instead of appointed. The Soviet Union was a new revolutionary nation constructed on beliefs falling outside the norm of international thought. Foreign forces had tried for its entire existence to put an end to the sovereign nation and revert back to a puppet of the West and capitalism. The Russian people knew the Tsarist life all too well, and increasing threats from international field and even threats from the inside the party made it impossible for the Soviet Union to be a totally free society in comparison to the pinnacle of Western freedom, America. Every revolution must defend itself by authoritarian means. The United States was no different after its own revolution in the late 1700s. The exile of loyalists and suppression of pro-British press became necessary for the revolutionary government. To expect a revolutionary government to guarantee a light grip or no grip at all on press and speech would be foolish. Besides, the United States was not facing threats from every European empire. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had little to no allies and had more than a handful of enemies. Revolutionary Russia was on the entire West chopping block. No society can guarantee freedom in such conditions, and to say otherwise would be ignorant. Despite this, the Soviet Union made historic strides in the liberation of the Russian worker and of women who lived in the independent nation. But if you ignore that part of its reasoning for its authoritarianism, you may claim that the Soviet Union didn't have freedom of speech, religion, assembly, and everything else that you expect to see in the US Constitution. This is yet another false claim because in the Soviet Constitution it says in Articles 118 to 131 that everyone was guaranteed employment and that unemployment would be abolished. It also states that the Soviet citizens had full pay while on vacations and the workday was only 7 hours long. Though not shown clearly in the Constitution, at least for me, the Soviet Union also had entirely free state-run healthcare that could be shown in Article 120. They even had free university and college education. The church was separated from the government as well as schools, but citizens could freely follow any religion they so please, as well as pass around anti-religious propaganda. An important part to add is that every citizen was guaranteed the freedom of speech, press, assembly, and street demonstrations in Article 125. Every citizen was guaranteed the same rights as other citizens, and anyone restricting any citizen's rights could be punished by law. Citizens were to safeguard and strengthen public socialist property, and anyone committing offenses against such property were enemies of the people. The Soviet Union did have universal military service as a law, as it was an honorable duty for citizens to have. This is the one part of the Constitution I disagree with, as I do not think that people should have to serve into the military if they don't want to, but I would assume it helped when World War II happened. When it comes to the part about freedom of speech, you may say that the Soviet Union could have violated that part of the Constitution. By doing so, you must acknowledge that the US violated their Constitution at the same time of Stalin's leadership and the Cold War. The Soviet Union arrested conservatives and far-right citizens, and the US did the same to socialists, communists, and other leftists. Both the US and the Soviet Union prosecuted their respected opposition in their countries. As for the leadership of the Soviet Union, in the beginning the Soviet Union under Lenin and his new economic policy, it was struggling to get off the ground to start industrializing. In 1929, 4 years after Stalin took power and 1 year after the first 5 plants started, crop production in the USSR was up to 118 hectares, and by the time it ended in 1933, it had produced about 130 hectares. When it comes to industrial output, under the first 5-year plan from 1929 to 1934, the Soviet Union was at an industrial output increase of 100%, while in the same time span the USA's industrial output was at a decrease to 65% of the 1929 industrial level. Though slightly lower or higher, the same goes for Britain, Germany, and France. This shows that when the Great Depression happened in October of 1929, the US economy crippled and the Soviet Union thrived because of central planning, and collectivization. The fourth and fifth five-year plans occurred during World War II, making industry more focused on the war and agriculture to feed soldiers, but the Soviet Union was still doing good while World War II occurred. When Stalin died in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev took control and denounced Stalin's purges and the Holodomor famine during the secret speech. Nikita Khrushchev got rid of the Gulag system set up by Stalin and tried to get rid of Stalin's cult personality, but we'll get to post-Stalin the Soviet Union in a while. The most common and joked about reason that communism is the Soviet Union was bad is that people starved all the time. When it comes to Soviet citizens not getting enough food or food shortages happening for the entirety of the Soviet Union's existence, this is simply not true. The caloric intake from 1925 all the way up to 1991, with the exception of missing data from 1941 to 1949, most likely due to World War II, the caloric intake stayed above 2,000 calories per person per day. And from 1935 to 1991, with the same missing data, the caloric intake stayed above 2,600 calories per person per day. Imperialist propaganda from the West and Europe has painted the picture of bread lines being around since the Soviet Union's creation, sometimes with real photos of such lines in the Soviet Union. The problem, however, is that the Soviet Union only experienced these accused shortages nearing its soon-to-be dissolution. From the mid to late 80s was when breadline photos were famously taken. This is significant because it was when revisionist liberalization of the Soviet economy was causing so much problems, which I will discuss in the post-Stalin period part of the video. Though a bit controversial, the Holodomor famine of 1932 to 1933 is commonly used to say that Stalin killed his citizens and that collectivization didn't work, but famines were normal in the early development of the Soviet Union and before in Tsarist Russia. Holodomor was caused by unfavorable weather conditions, a recovery from the kulak destruction of agriculture prior to, and other outside factors that had caused Russian famines for years. During this devastation, the Soviet government was underprepared. To expect immediate action by the Soviet government following the famine would be absurd. One of Stalin's missions as General Secretary was to instate Soviet order in Ukraine by getting rid of the region's agricultural ruling class, the kulak. With this being said, the Soviet Union did help with food shortages in Ukraine once word came to the Soviet government. The Politburo agreed to send tons of food for Ukrainian people, farmers, and civilians in general following the famine. Now ask yourself if these are the actions by a government wishing to starve its own people. Besides, Stalin was not in charge of trade or agriculture in the Soviet Union. He was a general secretary, so even if he himself, not the Soviet government, wanted to see Ukrainians starve, then he could not. But the actual evidence for the famine comes from, you wouldn't guess it, Nazis. This topic is far too extensive to get into in a single video, but I do recommend reading Fraud, Famine, and Fascism by Douglas Tuttle. Interesting enough, a substantial amount of the information regarding the deaths of communism have come from fake Nazi propaganda. When you start believing propaganda that the Nazis made against communists, that doesn't look good on what you think the truth is. After Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union started to place reformist policies that hurt the Soviet Union in terms of the economy. Of course, after Stalin, the gulags were mostly wiped out by Khrushchev, and the Soviet Union was more open on what they were doing. Stalin was paranoid and purged people. Stalin wasn't a good man, but what he did do for his citizens was good. Khrushchev was good as a person in some ways, but he tried to get rid of all of the good Stalin did for the Soviet Union. But I'll save that for another video. Now we must address Soviet innovation. One argument that gets said a lot but can be easily refuted is that the Soviets never innovated, but almost all modern life-saving and efficient inventions were produced in the USSR. When talking about military innovation, they made the TT-26 tank, which was a remote-controlled tank, the AK-47, and paratrooping. They even made the four-bladed helicopter, the tandem rotor, double rotor helicopter, and the first helicopter used by the US and UK, and it was the first mass-produced helicopter. The Soviet Union was heavily interested in space technology for a time and made rocket boots, the re-entry capsule, the orbital rocket, the spaceport, the space suit, space probe, space capsule, and the space station. When it comes to healthcare and performing new surgeries, the Soviets, specifically Vladimir Petrovich Demikov, performed the first kidney transplant, the first heart transplant, the first lung transplant, and the first head transplant. They also made the artificial heart and radial keratotomy, which is removing particles from the eyes. For safety and science, they made aerial refueling, the first commercial airliner. They discovered the gene pool, They made the pressure diving suit and underwater welding. The entertainment industry of the USSR had quite a few unseen innovations in filmmaking, animation, performing arts, and most notably the creation of 3D film and sound design without the use of Western intervention, including 3D color film. Pavel Mershon innovated consisting of 3 reels of individually colored film, which could be seen as the invention of the Covade 3-stripe technique pioneered by Ray Harryhausen in the US later on, giving us the iconic, if not problematic, cartoons of the era. Although these innovations were created after their debut, they were shelved for nearly 40 years before anyone but the audiences of the original showing would have the chance to see. Alexander Sheriev, an innovator in stop motion, wasn't an entertainer exactly, but his work went on to be used in animated features for the next 100 years. He was more interested in the scientific aspects of being able to slow down the human form to study human plastics, an idea conceived 100 years ago to be used in modern-day athletic training and scientific medical research. The Soviets were great innovators because of how they set their government up. The Soviet system allowed for more innovation to happen because of free healthcare, a shorter workday, and not having to worry about other problems in capitalist countries. But that'll have to do it for this video. One thing I should note is I am not apologizing for the terrible things that Stalin did, like the purges. I just wanted to make a video on why the Soviet Union under Stalin was good, and that capitalists are wrong when they talk about the Soviet Union. But while researching this video, I've learned a lot about the Soviet Union and made quite a few comrades. I would like to thank Citizen Fofi, link in the description, as well as Royal, Bumley, Comrade Spaceman, and Nigel of Discord. We all put a great amount of effort into our research for this video, and we'd like to thank you for watching the video. Whether you're an anarchist, Marxist-Leninist, democratic socialist, or whatever else, solidarity, comrades.